There are things that happen in the dark that don't leave marks on the skin. They leave marks on the voice. She appeared like a ghost. And when she spoke, oh, you could barely understand her. It hurts too much. He looked at her and knew something no one else did. This was not an accident. And the worst part, the one responsible was still nearby. The snow fell over Chicago like white ash, over a world that had already burned. It wasn't an ordinary snowfall. It was the kind of storm that turns the city into a colorless painting, that erases the streets and the names and the reasons, that makes everything look the same, white, silent, indifferent, as if the universe were trying to cover something it didn't want to see. Though Elaf Cartier ran barefoot through an alley on the south side, leaving bloodstains on the frozen asphalt. Her feet had stopped hurting 3 blocks back. The cold had taken care of that, numbing the nerves, freezing the skin until it became something that no longer felt like hers. Her dress, once white, once pretty, once put on with the stupid hope that tonight would be different, was torn from shoulder to waist. She had an open wound beneath her ribs, on the left side, bleeding with every step, every breath, every beat her body insisted on producing, even though she was no longer sure she wanted to keep beating. And the eyes. Ilawan's eyes were what nobody could have forgotten. They weren't the eyes of someone who was afraid. They were the eyes of someone who was no longer afraid of dying. She was afraid of something worse, of continuing to live exactly the way she had lived until that moment. She stumbled, not over something, over nothing, over the void, over the exhaustion of a body that had been punished too many times, and had finally decided it could no longer go on. Her knees hit the concrete with a wet sound that was lost in the snow. Her hands opened against the ground, as if trying to cling to the last second before giving up. The blood beneath her ribs mixed with the frozen water on the pavement. The pain was so immense that it was no longer pain. It was white noise, a constant hum that filled everything, that left no room for thoughts, or plans, or hope. And then, with a broken voice, with her lips trembling so badly the words barely formed, with the full weight of 27 years of silence crushing her chest like a marble slab, she whispered, "It hurts too much." She wasn't only talking about her body. She wasn't only talking about the bleeding wound, or her bare feet on the ice, or the bruises no one would count because there were too many. She was talking about everything, about every blow she never reported because they told her it was her fault, about every night she pretended to sleep while the monster she called her fiancé walked down the hall with a belt in his hand. About the little sister she left behind because she didn't have time to go back for her, about the guilt that weighed more than the blood, about the fear that weighed more than the guilt, and about the exhaustion, that absolute, cellular, spiritual exhaustion of running without anyone waiting for her on the other side. A shadow stopped at the end of the alley. It made no sound. It didn't speak. It didn't move right away. It just stood there, as if the universe had placed it in exactly that spot at exactly that moment, as if everything that had happened before, the storm, the blood, the escape, the pain, had been merely the prelude to this instant, tall, a long, dark overcoat that moved with the wind like a war banner. A jaw clenched with the force of someone who has spent years containing something he cannot say. Gray eyes, cold, deep, eyes that had seen too much death to blink at one more. A man that all of Chicago's underworld knew by a single name, Soren Aldrich, 41 years old, head of the Aldrich family, heir to an empire his father built with blood, and that he maintained with a combination of intelligence, controlled brutality, and a moral code that the rest of the criminal world considered a dangerous eccentricity. The kind of man who never raised his voice because he didn't need to. The kind of man people obeyed not out of fear, though there was fear. There was always fear, but because they knew, in some high, instinctive and primordial place, that disobeying him would be the last thing they did. He looked at her, not with pity. Pity was for the weak, and Soren Aldrich was not weak, not with indifference. Indifference would have been easier, safer, more consistent with the man the world believed him to be. He looked at her with something different, something that had no name but that only exists in the gaze of someone who recognizes a pain they've already lived, like a soldier who sees a wound identical to the one that killed him once. He removed his coat. He did it slowly, without sudden movements, as if he knew, and he did, for reasons he still hadn't told anyone, that quick movements near a wounded woman are more dangerous than any weapon. He walked to her. He knelt. He placed the coat over her shoulders without touching her skin. Not a brush, not a pressure, only the fabric, heavy and warm, falling over her like the closest thing to shelter Elowen had felt in years, and with a voice that was deep, low, nearly broken by something he hadn't said in years, something lodged in his chest like a piece of shrapnel the surgeons could never extract. He answered, "That's why I'm here." She lifted her eyes, brown eyes, dark, bright, with tears and fever. She searched for something in this stranger's face. She searched for the trap. She searched for the lie. She searched for the angle, the agenda, the hidden reason. Because in 27 years of life, every time someone had offered her help, the price had been worse than the problem. She didn't find any of that. And for the first time in her life, she found someone who didn't flinch at what was inside her, who didn't recoil from the pain or the rage or the accumulated darkness of years of survival. He stayed, kneeling in the snow, looking at her as if she were the only real thing in a world dissolving into white. Elowen tried to speak, tried to say something, but her body finally won the battle against her will, and the world went black. The last thing she felt before losing consciousness were hands lifting her from the ground. Large hands, firm, careful, hands that held her as if she were something worth saving. It had been a very long time since anyone had treated her that way. Soren didn't ask her questions. Not that night. Not because he didn't have them. He had hundreds. But because he had been in this world long enough to know that questions, when asked at the wrong time, are another form of violence. He carried her with care, one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back, distributing the weight so as not to press the wound on her side, as if he knew exactly where all the broken parts were, without needing to see them. The snow kept falling. The alley remained empty, and somewhere in the city, someone was looking for her. Soren knew it with the certainty of a man who has seen enough escapes to recognize one. Nobody runs barefoot in a snowstorm unless what they're leaving behind is infinitely worse than the cold. The armored SUV waited at the end of the street, with the engine running and the lights off. His right-hand man, Isaac Voronov, opened the rear door without a word. Isaac was 53 years old, had a scar crossing his left eyebrow, and possessed the ability, cultivated over 2 decades serving the Aldrichs, to understand entire situations with a single glance. He looked at Elowen, then at Soren. He registered the blood, the torn dress, the bare feet, the way Soren held her, and he understood everything there was to understand. He didn't ask where. He already knew. He took her to the penthouse. 42nd floor of a residential tower in the Gold Coast, Chicago's most expensive neighborhood. A place that appeared in no public record, no name on the mailbox, no security cameras feeding external servers. The kind of place where men like Soren Aldrich could exist without the world finding them, and where the world could exist without bothering them. It had 3 exits, 2 private elevators, a security system that would have made the Secret Service weep with envy, and a view of the city that, on clear nights, made Chicago seem like something worth protecting. Elowen didn't speak during the ride. Her eyes were open but empty, like a screen with no signal. She breathed irregularly. Short, shallow inhalations, with a barely perceptible whistle, indicating the wound was affecting her lung capacity. A constant tremor ran through her arms, not from cold, but the kind of tremor the body produces when the nervous system has processed too much trauma in too short a time and no longer knows what to do with the information. Soren recognized the symptoms. He had seen them before, in soldiers after combat, in witnesses after an explosion, in women after the worst. It wasn't just the wound. It was traumatic shock. He laid her on the living room couch, A cognac-colored leather piece that cost more than most people's cars, and that was now staining with blood, without Soren caring in the slightest. He called Dr. Merrick, a retired surgeon who owed his freedom and his medical license, and probably his life, to the Aldrich family. Marek asked no questions over the phone. He never did. He said 15 minutes, and arrived in 17 with a field surgical kit and the serene expression of a man who has stitched wounds at 3 in the morning so many times it's become part of his routine. But when he approached Aloan to examine her, something happened. She recoiled. Her entire body contracted like a spring. Her shoulders rose, her knees pressed together, her hands closed into fists so tight the knuckles went white. An involuntary whimper escaped her throat. Not a whimper of physical pain. Soren knew the difference. It was the sound someone makes who associates unfamiliar male hands with suffering. The sound of a body that has learned through repetition and terror that when a man approaches, what comes next is pain. Soren raised one hand. Marek stopped immediately. "Aloan," Soren said. His voice was low, firm, without an ounce of hurry, without urgency, without impatience, only presence, as if he had all the time in the world and was willing to use it. "This man is a doctor. His name is Marek. He's going to examine your wound. Only the wound, nothing else. I'll be here, in this chair, 5 feet away. If at any point you want him to stop, say so, and he'll stop. You don't need to give a reason. You don't need to explain anything. Just say stop, and he stops. Do you understand?" She looked at him. She searched for something in his face. She didn't find the fake smile she had learned to fear. That smile Victor wore just before everything got worse. The smile of a man who enjoys the moment between the promise and the blow. Oh. She didn't find the impatience that always preceded pain. That look of, "I'm doing this for your own good," that really meant, "I'm doing this because I can." She found something worse, sincerity. A naked, unadorned sincerity without an agenda. And that frightened her more than any threat, because a stranger's sincerity at 3 in the morning meant there were still things she could believe in. And believing was dangerous. Believing was opening a door she had kept sealed for years. She nodded, a small movement, barely perceptible, but enough. Marek worked with clinical precision. The wound beneath the ribs wasn't from a bullet. It was from a knife, a thin blade, probably a high-quality kitchen knife, the kind of knife a wealthy person would have in a kitchen they never used. The cut was clean, but deep. It had gone through the muscle layer, but by millimeters hadn't reached any vital organ. It required 14 internal stitches and 9 external ones. Marek used local anesthesia. Aloan clenched her teeth through the entire procedure. Every muscle in her body was taut. But she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't make a single sound. Soren watched her from the chair, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, that this was not the first time someone had stitched her up. A body that reacts this way to pain is not a body experiencing something new. It is a body that has learned to endure. It is a body trained in silence. When Marek finished suturing, he cleaned the wound one last time and covered it with sterile gauze. Then he gestured for Soren to come closer. They walked to the far end of the living room, out of Aloan's earshot. "The wound on her side will heal fine," Marek said quietly. "But that's not the worst of it. Talk. She has old marks on her back, linear scars. Some months old. Others years. At least 2 previous rib fractures that healed without medical attention. Bruises in various stages of healing on her arms and thighs. A burn mark behind the left shoulder that appears intentional." Marek paused, the pause of a man who has seen horrible things his entire life, but still retains the capacity for outrage. "This wasn't an incident, Soren. It was a system. Someone has been hurting her methodically and over a prolonged period. Years, not months." Soren didn't respond. He only closed his eyes 1 second too long. When he opened them, there was something different in them, not rage. Rage is noisy, and what Soren felt was silent. It was something colder, more definitive, the kind of emotion that isn't expressed but stored, organized, and converted into action. Antibiotics, painkillers, and rest, Merrick said. If the fever rises above 102 in the next 12 hours, call me. If the wound turns red or starts oozing, call me. If she stops eating or drinking water, call me. Anything else? Marek looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she needs a psychologist, but before that, she needs something no psychologist can prescribe. She needs to feel safe, and Soren, from the way that woman reacted when I approached, she hasn't felt safe anywhere in a long time. Marek left. Soren closed the door. He stood in the hallway for a full minute, his forehead pressed against the wood, breathing slowly. Processing, organizing, deciding. They prepared a room for her. Clean Egyptian cotton sheets. Water on the nightstand. An unopened, sealed bottle, because a man like Soren understood that someone who comes from where she comes from needs to be able to trust even the water she drinks. A small lamp she could turn on without getting up, with a switch within arm's reach. Clean clothes folded on a chair, a soft sweater, cotton pants, thick socks, all in approximate sizes, all unscented. All considered, Soren made sure the door had no lock on the outside, only on the inside. This was important. This was the difference between a refuge and a prison, a difference men like Victor Harlow never understood. Lock it if you want, he told her from the hallway, without entering, without peering in, giving her all the distance a wounded body and a frightened soul needed. Nobody's going to come in, including me, especially me. Elowen didn't respond. But when he walked away, he heard the click of the lock, and for a reason that shouldn't have made sense but made all the sense in the world. That hurt him more than the image of the blood on the snow, because that click meant she had learned, through beatings, stabbings, burns, that the only way to be safe was to place a physical barrier between herself and the rest of the world, and that wasn't caution. That was the legacy of someone who had destroyed her. Soren didn't sleep that night. He sat on the living room couch, the same couch where Elowen's blood was already drying on the leather, with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink, watching the city through the window. Chicago glowed below as if nothing had happened. Millions of lights. Millions of lives. And somewhere among those lights, someone was searching for a woman who was bleeding, in his living room. But Soren wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about another night. Another city. Another body on the floor. Only that time, the body wasn't breathing. That time, he had arrived 40 minutes late. That time, there had been no click of a lock because there had been no door, and only an empty warehouse and a 22-year-old woman who could no longer close her eyes because someone had closed them for her. Yara, his sister, his responsibility, his greatest failure. Soren squeezed the glass until his knuckles went white. Then he set it on the table, untouched. He leaned back against the couch, and he waited for dawn, with the patience of a man who has learned that darkness always ends, but that some nights last longer than others. 3 days passed before Elowen left the room of her own will. 3 days in which Soren left food outside the door 3 times a day. Breakfast at 7, toast, fruit, orange juice, a yogurt. Lunch at 1, soup, some protein, fresh bread. Dinner at 7. Whatever the catering service had dropped off, served on simple plates, without unnecessary luxury. Every tray included a sealed bottle of water and the medications Marek had left, with instructions handwritten in clear, unambiguous lettering. 3 days in which he never knocked on the door. Never spoke through it. Never asked if she was okay, because the answer was obvious, and asking would have been a form of pressure disguised as concern. He simply left the tray, tapped the floor twice with his knuckle, a soft sound, non-invasive, just so she'd know the food was there, and left. The trays came back. Sometimes full. Sometimes half-eaten. Sometimes only the water and medications were missing. Soren registered every detail mentally, not as a jailer, as a man who had learned, too late with Yara, that the signs of someone fading are small, silent, and easy to ignore if you're not paying attention. On the second day, Isaac approached with a cautious expression, My contacts identified the man, he said. Victor Harlow, son of Conrad Harlow. The family operates in... I know, Soren interrupted. I know who the Harlows are. They're looking for her, actively. They've mobilized 6 men on the south side and are reviewing traffic cameras. Let them look. Soren, if they find out you have her... What? Soren looked at him, and the look was enough to remind Isaac why he had spent 20 years following this man, and why, in all that time, he had never questioned a final decision. What are they going to do, Isaac? Come to my house? Demand I hand over a woman who was stabbed? Victor Harlow operates in my territory without my permission. He launders money through businesses I didn't authorize, and now I learn he drives knives into women. He paused. The pause was more eloquent than any speech. Let them look, and when they're done looking, we're going to have a conversation. Isaac nodded, not because he agreed with the risk exposure, but because he knew Soren well enough to understand that when he used that tone, the discussion was already over. On the 4th day, at 2 a.m, the bedroom door opened. Soren was in the living room. He wasn't sleeping. He barely slept since that night. He was reading something on a tablet, financial reports, security updates, whatever kept his mind occupied without demanding emotion. When he heard the door, he looked up. Elawan walked barefoot to the living room. She was wearing the sweater he had left. It was too big on her, covering her hands, making her look younger and smaller than she was. Her dark hair was tangled, falling over her face. Her eyes were still swollen. Her skin was pale. But she was standing. And that, for someone who 4 days earlier had been bleeding out in an alley, was an act of will that Soren recognized and silently respected. I can't sleep, she said. Her voice came out rough, worn, as if she had spent years using it, for nothing but begging or apologizing. Sit down, he replied, gesturing to the other end of the couch, not the spot beside him. The other end, 3 cushions apart, 5 feet of space that said more about who Soren Aldrich was than any reputation ever could. She sat. She wrapped herself in a blanket draped over the armrest. She drew her knees to her chest. And for a full hour, neither of them said a word. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you need to fill with conversation or noise or social pretexts. It was the kind of silence that exists between 2 people who understand that words sometimes are the most cowardly way to fill a void. That sometimes presence is enough. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do for someone is simply be there, breathing the same air, sharing the same space, demanding nothing in return. The city glowed through the window. The snow had stopped. The lights of Michigan Avenue reflected off the glass like fallen stars. It was the first night in years that Elwyn didn't have nightmares. She fell asleep on the couch around 3:30. Soren noticed when her breathing changed. It became deeper, more regular, slower. He watched her for a moment. Just a moment. Then he took another blanket from the hallway closet and laid it over her without touching her. He sat in the armchair across from the couch. And for the first time in 4 nights, he, too, closed his eyes. He didn't sleep, but he rested. And for a man like Soren Aldrich, that was almost the same thing. The next morning, while he made coffee in the kitchen, something his men found disconcerting and mildly disturbing, that the head of the Aldrichs, a man who controlled a $300 million empire, made his own coffee by hand, with ground beans, in a French press, every single morning without exception. She appeared in the doorway. Her hair was pulled back. She had washed her face. Her eyes were still swollen, but there was something different in them. A spark. Small. Fragile. But present. The spark of someone who has woken up and, at least for today, has decided to keep going. Who are you? She asked. Soren Aldrich. I know your name. What I want to know is what you are. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. A look that, in another context, in a business meeting, in a negotiation, in a dark alley, would have made anyone step back. But she didn't step back. She held it. With her swollen eyes and the oversized sweater and her bare feet on the cold marble, she held it. And Soren, who valued few things in this world but courage was one of them, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know what it was. He didn't try to name it. He only registered it. "I'm the kind of man you were taught to run from," he answered without adornment, without apology, without trying to soften anything. And they were probably right. "Then why am I not afraid?" Soren set the cup on the marble. He looked at her directly, and he said something that was not a comforting answer, or a compliment, or an evasion. It was the truth. "Because there are things worse than monsters, Elowen, and you've already met them." The silence that followed was long, but not heavy. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who have just established an invisible agreement. "I won't lie to you, and you won't lie to me. And from there, from that naked, uncomfortable honesty, we'll build whatever this is going to be." Elowen poured herself coffee. She sat at the kitchen bar, and for the first time in years, she ate breakfast without looking over her shoulder. It was in the second week that Elowen spoke. Not because she trusted Soren. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not yet, maybe never. But because the silence had become too heavy to carry alone. She had reached the point where the story needed to leave the body, or the body was going to collapse under its weight. They were in the living room. He was reading. He always read when he was with her, as if he wanted to give her the option of speaking, or not speaking, without the silence feeling like an obligation. She was looking out the window. Chicago stretched below, like an illuminated model of bad decisions and missed opportunities. "His name is Victor Harlow," she said suddenly, without preamble, without transition, as if she had been having this conversation in her head for days and simply decided to let the words out. "He's my fiancé. Or he was. I never had a choice to say no." Soren closed the book, not quickly, slowly, with the deliberate calm of someone who knows that what's coming is important and deserves his full attention. He set it on the table. He leaned back, and he looked at her with that total, absolute, unfiltered attention that made him so dangerous in a negotiation and so strangely reassuring in a conversation. Elowen spoke for 40 minutes without stopping. It was like opening a dam. The words came with the force of something held too long, disordered at first, then clearer, then with a precision that hurt, because it meant she had rehearsed this story in her head so many times she had it memorized like a script. Victor Harlow, 34 years old, heir to a family that laundered money through a chain of cosmetic clinics across 3 states. Full, handsome, in the way a knife is beautiful, shiny, and designed to cut. His father, Conrad Harlow, had brokered the engagement with the Cartier family when Elowen was 19. Her father, Gerald Cartier, a man who measured the value of his daughters by what they could produce as political and commercial alliances, handed her over the way someone signs a business contract. No consultation, no ceremony, no exit. Elowen was an asset in a transaction between families, not a person, a line in a ledger. Victor was charming for the first 6 months, the kind of charm that's studied, practiced in front of a mirror, deployed with the precision of a weapon. Flowers, restaurants, promises, attention that felt like oxygen, and Elowen, who was 19 years old and had never known what it was like to have someone pay genuine attention to her, believed it, because she needed to believe it, because the alternative was admitting she was trapped in something from which there was no escape. Then he stopped being charming. The first blow was a slap, a September night. They had argued about something insignificant. Elowen didn't remember what. The details of the provocation always fade. What remains is the sound of impact. Victor looked at her with empty eyes, raised his hand, and slapped her so hard her head turned 90 degrees. "An accident," he said afterward, cradling her face in his hands with a tenderness that was worse than the blow. "I was stressed. It won't happen again." And Elowen nodded, because she needed to believe it, because she still could. The second blow was a punch to the stomach that left her breathless for a full minute. The third was with a belt on her back, while she was turned away trying to open the bedroom door. After that, she stopped counting, not because the blows ceased, but because counting them was another way of reliving each one, and her mind had learned to protect itself the only way it knew how, by disconnecting. Victor was intelligent with violence, never the face after that first time, never where it would show with normal clothing, always in places that could be covered, back, ribs, thighs, upper arms, as if he had a manual, as if he had practiced, and the most terrifying thing was that he probably had. But what broke her wasn't the blows, it was Nadia Cartier, her younger sister, 15 years old. Enormous honey-colored eyes and an easy laugh that could fill entire rooms. The kind of person who still believed people were good, that promises were kept, that older siblings always came back. The only reason Elowen hadn't run before. Because Victor knew. He knew with the predatory intuition of someone who has studied fear until becoming an expert. And every time Elowen hinted at leaving, every time her eyes drifted too long toward the door, Victor mentioned Nadia. With a smile. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that said, "I can reach her before you make it to the corner." 3 weeks before that night in the alley, Elowen discovered something that changed everything. It was an accident. Or maybe not. Maybe her subconscious had been pushing her toward this for months without her knowing. Going through Victor's phone while he slept, a habit born of fear, not jealousy. She needed to read his mood before he woke up to prepare herself. She found messages, encrypted transactions, photographs, coordinates. Victor wasn't just laundering money through the clinics. He was trafficking people, young women, some of them minors. He moved them along routes that passed through Detroit, Milwaukee, and St. Louis, using the clinics as fronts and medical supply trucks as transport, and the next shipment route, scheduled for 3 weeks later, a cargo leaving Chicago for a private port in Canada, had a name noted in the margin, written in Victor's careless handwriting, as if it were a casual note on a shopping list. Nadia Cartier. Elowen didn't cry when she read it. Found something inside her that had been dying for years. The hope that things would get better, the belief that if she endured long enough the pain would stop, the illusion that Victor had a limit, finally died completely. And in its place grew something hard, sharp, irreversible, not vengeance, not rage, something clearer than that, certainty. The absolute certainty that she had to get out. Estindi, not tomorrow, not next week, now. She copied the files, every message, every transaction, every photograph. She uploaded them to an encrypted cloud. Using an email Victor didn't know, with passwords he couldn't guess, and 3 days later, when Victor traveled to Detroit for a meeting she knew involved the trafficking route, Elowen put on a white dress, not for symbolism, but because it was the easiest thing to reach, took cash from Victor's safe, and left. But Victor found her. He always found her. A GPS tracker in her purse she hadn't discovered. They intercepted her at the Greyhound station. 2 of his men, big, silent, efficient. They put her in a black car with tinted windows and took her to a warehouse on the west side. Victor was waiting, sitting in a metal chair, legs crossed, with a calm smile and a kitchen knife in his hand. "It's not about what you took," he told her, standing slowly, running the blade along her cheek without cutting, like a painter evaluating a canvas before making the first stroke. "It's because you thought you could leave. That's what I can't allow, you understand. It's not personal, it's principle." When the knife entered beneath her ribs, Elowen didn't scream. She bit her own tongue until it bled. And when Victor turned to answer a phone call, because for him, stabbing his fiancée was a minor interruption in his schedule, an errand between a business meeting and a restaurant reservation, she crawled to the side door. Every inch was a negotiation with pain. Every second was a decision to continue. And when she made it to the alley, when the cold Chicago air hit her face like a slap of reality, she ran. She ran with no direction, no plan, no destination. Only the animal certainty that stopping meant dying, and dying meant Nadia had no one, until she couldn't anymore, until the alley, until the snow, until Soren. When she finished talking, the silence in the penthouse was so dense that it seemed to have physical weight. Soren hadn't moved. He hadn't changed expression. He hadn't interrupted. He hadn't made sounds of understanding or empathy, because he knew that those sounds, when they come from someone who hasn't lived what you've lived, can sound like condescension. But something in his eyes had darkened over the 40 minutes, like a storm forming on the horizon without making a sound, but that everyone knows will devastate everything. "The files you copied," he said finally. His voice was controlled, precise, the voice of a man converting emotion into strategy. "Do you still have them?" "They're in an encrypted cloud. Victor doesn't know where. He doesn't know they exist." Soren nodded slowly, processing, calculating. "And your sister?" Elawan closed her eyes, and for the first time since arriving at the penthouse, she cried, not in silence like the previous nights, when tears fell on their own in the darkness of the room, as if her body needed to drain without her permission. This time she cried with sound, with trembling, with the abandon of someone who has maintained a wall for years, and who finally feels the first crack and knows that if she lets it spread, the entire wall will collapse. "She's still with my father. He won't protect her. He never protected us. He saw us as bargaining chips. Nadia still believes Dad is going to take care of her. She still believes that." Her voice broke on the last sentence. Not for herself, for Nadia, for the innocence her sister still possessed, and that the world was about to destroy. Soren stood. He walked to the window. He looked at the city for a full minute. Chicago was still there, indifferent, glittering, oblivious to the pain that existed on the 42nd floor of a tower that didn't even appear on maps. When he spoke, his voice had a new edge, not of rage, of something deeper, of a decision that was already made before the words formulated it. "Victor Harlow operates in my territory. He uses my roots. He launders money in my city. He traffics people I swore no one would touch. He crosses lines I drew 15 years ago when I took control of this family. That makes it my problem, not your problem, my problem. I'm not asking you to fight my battles," Elawan said, wiping the tears with the back of her hand, with a dignity that cost her everything she had. "You're not asking, and I'm not doing it for you," she frowned, confused. "Then for whom?" Soren didn't turn around. He kept looking at the city, but his reflection in the glass showed something his face never allowed the public to see. Pain. Old. Calcified. Encrusted. The kind of pain that doesn't heal because you don't let it heal, because healing it would mean letting go of something, and letting go would mean forgetting, and forgetting is a betrayal Soren Aldrich was not willing to commit. "I had a sister," he said, and the words came out as if each one weighed tons, as if every syllable were a brick that had to be torn from a wall, built to let nothing through. "Her name was Yara. She was 22 when they killed her. She was smart, smarter than me probably. She studied architecture at Northwestern. She wanted to design public libraries. Libraries. That's what she cared about. That people would have a beautiful place to sit and read." He paused, not briefly. At length, the pause of a man visiting a room in his memory that he keeps locked. "A deal that went bad. A partner who decided the best way to pressure me was to take her. I was in Detroit. 40 minutes by plane. 40. A flight delayed by bad weather. A phone call that arrived 16 minutes late because my phone was on silent during a meeting that didn't matter." He turned. He looked at her directly, and Elawan saw, for the first time, what lay behind Soren Aldrich's mask. Not coldness, not control, not power, guilt. A guilt so enormous, so all-consuming, so embedded in every fiber of his being, that it had become the very structure on which he had rebuilt his life. By the time I arrived, there was nothing left to save. Only a body on the floor of a warehouse that looked a lot like the one you described. A lot. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before. It wasn't the comfortable silence of two people sharing space. It was the sacred silence that exists when someone shows you the worst wound they have and you decide not to look away. "Why are you helping me?" Elawan asked, her voice cracking on the last syllable, "because no one helped her when she needed it." That her filled the entire room, filled the space between them, filled the silences of the weeks before, filled the food trays left untouched, and the sleepless nights, and the click of the lock, and the morning coffee. Elowen understood then. Soren Aldrich hadn't picked her up from the alley out of charity, or strategy, or interest, or whim. He had picked her up because every woman who bled alone in the dark was Yara. Every time he didn't arrive in time. Every time the world failed. Every time someone with power looked the other way. She was the opportunity the universe was giving him to do what he couldn't do then. Not a second chance to save his sister, because Yara was dead and nothing would bring her back, but a second chance to be the man he wasn't that night. She said nothing. There was no need. Some truths are so large that words don't do them justice. That night, Elowen didn't lock her bedroom door. And Soren, for the first time in 6 years, didn't dream about the warehouse. The weeks that followed were strange, not good or bad. Strange, like learning to breathe after being underwater so long you forgot what air felt like. Like walking through a house that isn't yours, but that begins slowly, imperceptibly, to feel like something close to home. Soren didn't change his routine for her. He still woke at 5 in the morning. He still made calls in a low voice from his study, a space Elowen had never seen and didn't try to see because she understood there were parts of Soren's life that existed in a darkness where she didn't need to go. He still received men in suits in the living room who looked at her with poorly concealed curiosity and who, after a single look from Soren, a look that wasn't a threat but something worse, an instruction, stopped looking at her as if she had never existed. But he changed small things. He changed the details, and Elowen, who had survived 8 years with Victor by learning to read details, like an animal reads the signals of a predator, noticed every single one. He left books on the dining room table, not the ones he read. Essays on geopolitics, military history, biographies of men who changed the world through force. But others. Novels. Poetry. A color-illustrated botany book that Elowen glanced at with curiosity the first day, with interest the second, and that by the third she was reading with annotations in the margins made with a pencil that appeared beside the book as if it had always been there. He stopped wearing cologne on the days he was in the penthouse because he noticed that strong scents made her tense. He said nothing about it. He didn't seek confirmation. He just stopped doing it, as if it were a minor decision, but it wasn't. It was the decision of a man who paid attention to another person's body language with the same rigor he paid to fluctuations in the black market. He never sat between her and the door, in any room, at any time. If she was in the living room, he positioned himself so she always had a direct line to the exit. If he entered the kitchen while she was cooking, something she started doing in the 3rd week, simple dishes at first, then more elaborate ones that filled the penthouse with aromas that smelled like life. He positioned himself so she could leave if she wanted without having to pass beside him. He never touched her, not even casually, not a brush when passing a plate, not an adjustment of the blanket when she fell asleep on the couch, not a hand on the shoulder when saying goodnight. Nothing. Zero contact. As if he knew, and he did, with the clarity of someone who has studied others' pain not from academic curiosity, but from personal necessity, that her body needed to relearn that hands could exist nearby without causing harm. That human touch was not always a prelude to suffering. That physical proximity was not synonymous with danger. Elowen noticed everything, every detail, every silent adjustment, every invisible sacrifice, and each one was like a brick in a wall being built in the opposite direction from every wall she had ever known, not to trap her, but to protect her, not to limit her space, but to expand it. One morning she found him in the kitchen with his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows, washing dishes. A man who commanded a criminal empire, who had dozens of people willing to do anything for him, with a single phone call, was washing dishes by hand, with lavender soap, at 7 in the morning, with the concentration of someone who finds meditation in mundane tasks. You could hire someone for that, she said from the doorway, leaning against the frame, holding a coffee cup between her hands. I could, he replied without looking at her, rinsing a plate with slow, precise movements. but I don't like having people in my space. I'm in your space. He looked at her then, and something in his eyes, something brief, nearly imperceptible, like a flame that flickers in a dark room before the wind either extinguishes it or feeds it, made her hold her breath. It wasn't desire. It wasn't intention. It was recognition. The involuntary recognition that her presence had changed something in the texture of his daily life, and that this change, though unexpected, was not unwelcome. You're not people, Elowen. You're something different. He didn't say it flirtatiously. He didn't say it with romantic intent. He didn't say it the way Victor would have, as a compliment disguised as a chain, as a way to make her feel special, so he could then use that feeling as a tool of control. He said it like someone stating a fact they don't yet understand, but can no longer ignore. Like a scientist observing a phenomenon that doesn't fit into any known category, and who, instead of dismissing it, decides to study it. She didn't reply. She poured more coffee. She sat at the bar, and for the first time in years, she let her bare feet dangle from the stool without feeling like the floor might open beneath her. The first time they touched was an accident. Elowen was trying to reach a book on a high shelf in the living room. The botany book she'd been reading referenced another text that Soren had apparently placed on the upper shelf, probably without thinking about the height difference. She stretched, got on her tiptoes, reached the book's spine with her fingertips. But when she pulled, the wound on her side, already healing but still sensitive, still a constant reminder of what had happened, sent a sharp stab of pain that made her lose her balance. Soren was behind her. He had just entered the living room. He saw her sway, and his body reacted before his mind. Instinct, training, the reflexes of a man who has lived in a world where half a second marks the difference between life and death. He caught her, his hands on her waist, firm, careful, without pressure, exactly the force needed to stabilize her without squeezing. Elowen went still, not because she was afraid. And that was what astonished her. She didn't tremble. She didn't recoil. She didn't feel the familiar nausea she associated with male contact. What she felt was different. It was warmth, a clean warmth. Safe, like sunlight on your face after an endless winter. Like warm water on frozen hands, like coming home after a journey so long you'd forgotten the house existed. "Are you okay?" he asked. His voice was closer than usual. She could feel his breath in her hair. But he didn't move. He didn't release her, but he didn't tighten his grip either. He gave her exactly what she needed, the option. "Yes," she whispered. And then, in a voice so low it was barely a sound, "Don't let go yet." He didn't let go, and for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. They stayed like that, her with her back against his chest, him behind her, his hands on her waist, his pulse against her back, two hearts beating. In a rhythm neither had requested but both needed, with an urgency they couldn't explain, and didn't try to explain. Then she stepped away, slowly, without hurry, and he let her go. Without resistance, without question, without visible disappointment, he let her go with the same naturalness with which he had held her, as if both gestures, holding and releasing, were equally important, equally respectful, equally necessary. Neither mentioned what had happened, not that afternoon, not that night, not the next day. But something had changed, something invisible but definitive, like a crack in a wall of ice through which spring begins to seep. And that night, when Elowen fell, asleep on the couch while reading, Soren laid a blanket over her. And as he did, his fingers brushed her hair. A gesture so small it barely existed. But for a man who hadn't been gentle with anyone in 6 years, who had turned hardness into identity and distance into survival, it was like opening a door he had welded shut with the intention of never walking through again. And on the other side of that door, there was no darkness. There was light. Victor Harlow was not a patient man, but he was methodical. He had that rare and dangerous combination of emotional impulsiveness and strategic coldness. He could stab a woman in a fit of control and 1 hour later organize a search operation with the efficiency of a logistics director. It took him 3 weeks to locate Elowen, not because Soren was careless, The penthouse security protocols were airtight, designed by an Israeli specialist Soren had hired 5 years prior. But because Victor had something that money couldn't buy and loyalty couldn't absolutely guarantee, a mole. His name was Dmitry Kortchak. Polish, 38 years old. He had been with the Aldrichs for 7 years. He was discreet, efficient, invisible, the kind of man nobody notices at meetings, who walks through hallways without making a sound, who is always there but never stands out. Perfect for security, perfect for betrayal. Victor paid him 3 times what Soren did, and Dmitry owed a gambling debt to a Warsaw syndicate that not 3 lifetimes of work could settle. The math was simple. Betraying Soren was risky but survivable. Not paying Warsaw was a guaranteed death sentence. It was Dmitry who told Victor the woman was in the Gold Coast penthouse. It was Dmitry who disabled the North Corridor cameras during scheduled maintenance windows. And it was Dmitry who left the service entrance to the underground parking garage open at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in February, claiming the sensor was malfunctioning. Aloan woke to the sound of footsteps that were not Soren's. She knew it with the certainty of instinct. In the weeks she'd been in the penthouse, she had learned to distinguish his way of walking. Firm, spaced, with weight distributed like someone who knows how to move silently but chooses not to, who walks with intention, not stealth. These footsteps were different, fast, multiple, furtive, the kind of steps that try not to be heard, which makes them infinitely more terrifying than any heavy footfall. She got up. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her wrists, in her temples, in her throat. But she didn't freeze. That was the new thing. That was what weeks alongside Soren, weeks of safety, of respect, of being treated like a human being, had given back to her. The ability to react instead of shutting down. She grabbed the first thing she found, a heavy table lamp, marble base, an object that in another life was decorative, and in this one was a weapon, and pressed herself against the wall beside the door. The door opened. A man came in. It wasn't Victor. It was one of his soldiers, big, fast, with a syringe in his right hand. Ketamine probably, something to knock her unconscious without killing her, because Victor wanted her alive, because dead she couldn't suffer. The man turned toward the bed, expecting to find her asleep. Aloan smashed the lamp into his temple, with every ounce of force her 140-pound body could produce. The marble connected with bone. The sound was wet, definitive. He dropped to his knees. She didn't wait to see if he got up. She ran. In the hallway, chaos had already erupted. 2 of Soren's men were on the floor, not dead, incapacitated by electric shocks. Another was fighting an intruder near the kitchen, bodies slamming against marble with sounds like miniature car crashes. And at the end of the corridor, lit by the cold light of the moon, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling window, Soren Aldrich was standing. He had a gun in his right hand. His jaw was smeared with blood that wasn't his. His hair was disheveled for the first time since Aloan had known him. And his eyes, those gray eyes that had been her first refuge, burned with something she had never seen in him. Not rage, not fear, but a determination so absolute it seemed to alter the gravity around him. He was facing 3 men who had made the terminal mistake of entering his home. Aloan watched him move and understood for the first time why the world feared him. It wasn't the violence. She had known violent men her entire life. And violence alone doesn't earn respect, only terror. It was the precision. Every movement was calculated, every decision made before the situation demanded it. He didn't fight with rage. He fought with a terrifying calm, like a surgeon operating under fire, like a chess player moving pieces on a board, where the pieces bled. But there were too many. 6 had entered. 4 through the service door. 2 through the parking access. Coordinated. Professional. These weren't common criminals. They were trained operators. The 4th man appeared through the service entrance. The one Dmitry had left open. The one that should have been locked. The one that represented the difference between security and catastrophe. And fired. The bullet caught Soren in the left shoulder. The impact spun him, but he didn't fall. He completed the rotation, used the momentum, fired. The man went down, but the second bullet came from another angle, from behind the kitchen bar, from a fifth man nobody had seen, and tore through his left side, entered the front, exited the back, clean but devastating. This time he fell. Elawan screamed. Not a scream of terror. She had stopped screaming from terror years ago. Victor had taught her that screaming served no purpose. This was different. This was the scream of something primal, visceral, ancestral. The scream of someone who refuses to lose the only good thing she's found in a world designed to take everything from her. She ran to him. The remaining men were already being contained by Isaac and the response team that arrived seconds later. Men who lived on the floor below, trained for exactly this contingency, who came up the stairs with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. But Elawan didn't see any of that. She didn't see the weapons. She didn't see the blood that wasn't hers. She didn't see the intruders being subdued. She only saw Soren on the floor, his hand pressing against his side, his eyes still open, still alert, still searching for her through the chaos, as if she were the only thing that mattered in a room full of armed men. Are you okay?" he asked, bleeding on the floor of his own home, with a bullet in his shoulder and another that had passed through his torso. And the first thing he asked was if she was okay. Elawan knelt beside him. She put her hands over the hood, wound on his side. She felt the blood, warm between her fingers, viscous, real, terrifying in its abundance. She held his gaze with an intensity he had never seen in her. Not the look of a frightened woman, but the look of a woman who was deciding in that instant that she would not allow the universe to take one more thing from her. "It hurts," she whispered. She wasn't talking about her body. She was talking about seeing him like this, about knowing he had placed himself between her and death, as if his life were worth less than hers. About understanding, with brutal clarity, that this man, this cold man, this dangerous man, this man the world feared and whom she had begun to love without permission and without remedy, had chosen his body as a shield. Soren looked at her, and with his voice weakened, with blood on his lips, with the same certainty he had spoken with that first night in the alley, with the same gravity, the same calm, the same presence, he murmured, "That's why I'm here." The same words, different context. This time they weren't the words of a stranger rescuing an unknown woman in the snow. They were the words of a man who had chosen, consciously, deliberately, knowing exactly what it would cost him, to put his body between danger and the woman who had become the reason his heart still beat with purpose. Isaac found Dmitri trying to escape through the underground parking 20 minutes later. He stopped him without violence. He looked at him with a disappointment that hurt more than any blow. The disappointment of a man who considered you family and who just discovered you never were. And he locked him in a windowless room in the basement, where he would wait for Soren to decide what to do with him. If Soren survived to decide. In the back of a private ambulance on the way to the clinic, Elawan held Soren's hand so tightly, her knuckles turned white. "Don't you dare die," she told him. Her voice trembled, but not from fear. From fury. The clean, pure, incandescent fury of someone who has just discovered that she cares about someone with an intensity she didn't think possible, and the universe is already trying to take him away. Tussie Soren, despite the pain burning through his side, despite the blood soaking the gauze, despite the pallor stealing color from his face, did something Elawan had never seen him do. He smiled, a small smile, weak but real. The first genuine smile in years, the smile of a man who discovers on the edge of death that he still has a reason to stay. "I wasn't planning on it." The bullet to the side hadn't hit vital organs, but it had caused enough muscular and vascular damage to require emergency surgery. Soren was operated on at a private clinic on the outskirts of Evanston, a place that didn't ask questions, that didn't file records with real names, and that the Aldrich family had financed for 2 decades in exchange for absolute discretion and impeccable medical competence. The surgery lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Elawan sat in a plastic chair for every second of it. Soren's men offered her alternatives. Isaac, his face still tense from the penthouse containment operation, approached with a list of options: a safe house in Wisconsin, an apartment in Lincoln Park, with its own security, a flight to Montreal where they had contacts, separate protection, distance. Elowen looked at them with a new calm, a calm she hadn't had weeks before. The calm of someone who has made a decision, and that decision, for the first time in her life, is completely her own. I'm staying. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. The kind that doesn't admit discussion or counter-argument. Isaac didn't argue. He'd seen enough in his 20 years alongside Soren to recognize when something was inevitable. He nodded once and organized the clinic's security, as if it were a military operation. During Soren's recovery, something changed between them. Not dramatically. Not with grand declarations or cinematic moments. It changed the way seasons change. Slowly, inevitably, in the details nobody points out, but everyone feels. Like the exact moment when cold stops being cold, and the air begins to smell of wet earth. Elowen read to him, not deep books or transcendental poetry. She read him newspaper articles about absurd things, a man in Wisconsin who collected antique mailboxes and had more than 400 in his yard, a woman in Japan who knitted sweaters for penguins rescued from oil spills, an annual competition in Finland where men carried their wives through an obstacle course and the prize was the wife's weight in beer. Things that had nothing to do with blood or betrayal or the weight of the world. Things that existed only to remind them that the world also contained absurdity and humor and tenderness and all those small things that make life worth living even when most of the time it seems not to be worth anything. Soren listened with his eyes closed and an expression his men didn't recognize. It wasn't the mask of control he wore in meetings. It wasn't the coldness he deployed in business. It wasn't the silent threat he projected by default. It was something soft, something human, something he had buried with Yara in that grave at Graceland Cemetery, and that Elowen was unearthing without even trying, with articles about penguins in sweaters and wife-carrying competitions. One afternoon, while she was changing the bandage on his side, she had learned to do it with an efficiency that impressed Marek himself. "You have a surgeon's hands," he told her, and she replied, "I have the hands of someone who learned to patch herself up alone." Her fingers paused over the new scar. "You have a lot of these," she said quietly, tracing the map of cuts, impacts, and sutures that decorated Soren's torso like an atlas of dangerous decisions. "I have a long life of short decisions," he replied, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. "Do you ever regret them?" "The scars, no. The ones I don't have, yes." She understood. The scars he didn't have were from the battles he didn't fight. The times he arrived late. The times he wasn't there. The 40 minutes he needed to save Yara. This one's new," she said, touching the wound on his side with a gentleness that contrasted with the brutality of how it had been made. "That one's yours," he replied, stopping his gaze at the ceiling to look at her directly. Without evasion, without metaphor. He didn't say it as an accusation. He said it as a fact. That wound existed because he chose to place himself between her and a bullet, and he would do it again, without doubt, without hesitation, without regret. Just as she had a scar beneath her ribs that told Victor's story, he now had one that told Elowen's. And both scars, in some way, answered each other. Elowen pulled her fingers back, not because the touch frightened her, but because what she felt was so large, so expansive, so impossibly vast that she didn't know where to put it. It was like trying to hold the ocean in her hands. She couldn't, but she didn't want to let go either. "Soren," she said, and his name in her mouth sounded different from how it sounded in anyone else's. Not like a title, not like a threat, not like a surname of power, like something sacred, like a word that held more meaning than its 5 letters could contain. "I'm not a cause. I'm not your sister. I'm not your second chance. I'm not your redemption." He looked at her for a long time, slowly, with that intensity that made the air go thick and time lose its relevance. "I know." "Then what am I?" "I don't know yet," he said, and the honesty of that admission was more powerful than any declaration would have been. "But I know that before you this house was silent, and now it's not. And I don't want it to be silent again. It was the most honest declaration Soren Aldrich had ever made in his life. More honest than any oath. More vulnerable than any wound. It wasn't an "I love you," because "I love you" was easy to say and even easier to fake. It was something harder, rarer, more valuable, an "I need you," said by a man who had built his entire existence around not needing anyone, and who now, in a clinic bed, with fresh sutures and an aching body, discovered that his greatest strength was also his deepest weakness. Before confronting Victor, they had to get Nadia out. This was non-negotiable. It was the condition Elowen set before any plan, any strategy, any move. Her sister first, everything else after. Elowen insisted on participating in the planning. Soren didn't want her to, not because he underestimated her. After watching her smash a marble lamp into the skull of an armed man, underestimating Elowen, Cartier would have been an unforgivable miscalculation, but because he knew what it meant to get close again to the world she had escaped. He knew that every mile closer to her father's house was a mile closer to the hell she'd left behind. But Elowen looked at him with those eyes that were no longer the eyes of a broken woman. They were the eyes of a woman who was rebuilding herself piece by piece, scar by scar, decision by decision. The eyes of someone who was choosing, for the first time in her life, the shape of her own story. She's my sister. I'm not going to hide. Soren studied her for 5 long seconds. He looked for fear. He didn't find any. He looked for doubt. None. What he found was determination. Pure, clean, immovable. The determination of a woman who had already paid the highest price a person can pay, and who now had nothing to lose except the only thing that still mattered. All right, but we do it my way. If something goes wrong, you listen to me without arguing, understood? Understood. The operation was surgical in its precision. Isaac coordinated a team of 6, each with a specific function, each with clear instructions and defined contingencies. Elowen provided the critical intelligence, her father's schedules, the house layout, Nadia's routines, the location of the home security cameras, the alarm code. Soren made a call to Elowen's father, Gerald Cartier, that lasted exactly 90 seconds. 90 seconds that shifted the balance of power of an entire family. Mr. Cartier, this is Soren Aldrich. I have your older daughter under my protection. I'm going to take the younger one. If you try to prevent it, I will release the agreements you signed with Victor Harlow, including those involving the trafficking of minors. You have 10 minutes to leave the house with whatever you can carry. The next time we speak, it will be through a lawyer, or we won't speak at all. Gerald Cartier didn't respond. He didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He didn't try to negotiate, because Gerald Cartier was, fundamentally, a coward. And cowards, when faced with someone who doesn't fear them, don't fight. They run. 10 minutes later, his car pulled out of the garage of the Winnetka house and took the highway south. He didn't come back. Nadia was in her bedroom when Elowen walked in, the room of a 15-year-old girl. On walls covered in posters of bands Elowen didn't recognize, clothes on the floor, books stacked in a corner, a computer open on a desk cluttered with papers and colored pencils. Nadia looked at her, and her eyes, those honey-colored eyes identical to their dead mother's, the same eyes Elowen saw every time she needed to remember why to keep going, filled with something that wasn't surprise. It was relief, the devastating relief of someone who has been waiting for something they no longer believed possible. Elowen. Her voice cracked on the second syllable, and then she ran. She crossed the room in 3 steps and launched herself at her sister with the full force of a teenager who had spent weeks not knowing if her older sister was alive or dead. Elowen wrapped her arms around her, held her tight, felt her body shake, felt the warm tears on her neck, felt, for the first time since that night in the alley, that everything she had endured, the knife, the pain, the escape, the weeks of rebuilding, had served a purpose. "Let's go," Elowen said. And in that single phrase was everything. Forgiveness for having left her, rage for having had to, and the promise that never again. Never again. Nadia didn't need an explanation. She was 15, but she wasn't naive. She was the daughter of a world where intuition develops fast or doesn't develop at all. She grabbed a backpack, packed what she could, a sweater, a book, a phone charger, the photo of their mother from her nightstand, and walked to the door, holding her sister's hand. In the hallway, she encountered Soren. She looked him up and down with the absolute, total, unshakable distrust of a 15-year-old girl who has grown up in a family where big, silent men are synonymous with danger. She assessed him the way you assess an unfamiliar dog, with caution, with distance, searching for signs of threat. "Who is he?" she asked Elowen, without taking her eyes off Soren. Elowen looked at Soren. Soren looked at Elowen. And in that exchange of glances there was an entire conversation that didn't need words, a conversation about what they were, what they weren't, what they were beginning to be. "Someone who's going to take care of us," Elowen answered. Nadia evaluated Soren for 5 more seconds. She measured him with that ability teenagers have to see through the layers adults wear and arrived directly at the center. Then she nodded once, a gesture that was simultaneously conditional approval and implicit warning, as if to say, "Fine, but if you hurt her, you'll deal with me." Soren, without quite knowing why, he who had negotiated with cartels, who had survived 3 assassination attempts, who had looked death in the eye without blinking, felt that he had just passed the most difficult exam of his life. Victor Harlow agreed to the meeting because he was arrogant, because he believed the world operated according to his rules, because he thought Soren Aldrich was simply another man of power with whom he could negotiate, make deals, trade favors. Another cog in a machine Victor believed he controlled. He was wrong. The meeting was at a closed restaurant in the West Loop, a high-end Italian place that closed on Mondays. The table was set as if for a normal business dinner. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, artisan bread in a basket, a bottle of wine nobody was going to drink. Soren arrived first. He sat down. He didn't order anything. He waited with the patience of a man who knows time is on his side. Victor arrived with 2 bodyguards, shark smile, impeccable 3-piece suit, gold cufflinks, Italian shoes that cost more than most Americans' monthly salary. The kind of man who walks through the world as if it were a foreign catalog from which he can take whatever he wants, including people. He sat across from Soren, crossed his legs, poured himself wine without waiting for an invitation. "Aldrich, I believe you have something that belongs to me." Soren didn't respond immediately. He took a sip of water, set the glass down on the table with millimetric precision, aligned with the edge of the plate. And when he spoke, his voice was so low that Victor had to lean in to hear. Which was exactly the point. Forcing a man to lean toward you is the first way of establishing who holds the power. Elowen Cartier doesn't belong to you. She never belonged to you. And if you refer to a human being as property in my presence again, this conversation is going to end in a way you won't like. Victor smiled. The smile of a man who doesn't recognize his own extinction when it's sitting across from him. "We're talking business, Soren. She has my files. I want my files. Give her back and we stay partners. Simple. We're not partners. We never were. You operated in my territory without my permission. You used my distribution routes for human trafficking, women, minors. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think that being Conrad Harlow's son gave you immunity?" For the first time, Victor's smile wavered. It didn't disappear, but it cracked, like a porcelain mask taking its first blow. "That's business, supply and demand. Everyone has their—" "No." Soren cut him off, a single syllable, pronounced like a verdict. "There are lines. My father drew them. I hardened them. You crossed them, and now you're going to pay. Are you threatening me?" Soren leaned forward, slowly, controlled. His eyes were 2 black surfaces without reflection, without warmth, without mercy. The eyes of someone who has already made a decision, and that decision has no appeal. "I'm informing you, Elowen's files are already in the hands of 3 federal agencies, FBI, ICE, and the Illinois District Attorney's Office. Your clinic network has been under IRS audit since this morning. Your father was detained 40 minutes ago at O'Hare Airport trying to leave the country on a forged passport. Your accounts in Switzerland and the Caymans are frozen, and you, Victor, are sitting in an empty restaurant surrounded by my men, drinking wine you didn't pay for, believing you still have options. Victor looked around. The waiters were gone. The kitchen door was closed. His bodyguard on the right wore an expression he'd never seen before. Fear. The one on the left wasn't moving, not by choice, but because Isaac and another member of Soren's team stood behind them, visible, calm, with clear instructions. The red wine trembled in Victor's glass, a minimal vibration, but Soren saw it, and that vibration told him everything he needed to know. Victor Harlow, for the first time in his life, was terrified. You drove a knife beneath her ribs, Soren said, and for the first time his voice lost its artificial calm. The volume didn't rise, but something changed in the texture, like the sound ice makes just before it breaks. You left marks on her back that are years old. You treated her as if she were an object you could break and repair at will. And when she dared to run, when she gathered the courage that you have never had for anything, you stabbed her like you were signing a document. And you thought you could use her younger sister, a 15-year-old girl, as merchandise. Victor tried to stand. He couldn't. Not because anyone was holding him down, but because his legs wouldn't respond. Terror has that quality. It paralyzes the body before the mind processes the reason. It is the oldest mechanism in human biology, and no amount of money or power in the world can prevent it. Soren stood up. He walked around the table with slow, measured steps, each one echoing in the silence of the empty restaurant. He stopped beside Victor, leaned down, and whispered into his ear something Victor would feel in every nightmare he had left. You're going to prison. You're going for a long time. And every day you're in there, every night in a cell that doesn't lock from the inside. Every morning you wake up unable to decide even what you eat for breakfast. You'll know it was her who put you there. Not me. Her. The woman you thought was weak. The woman who destroyed you without raising a fist. He straightened up, adjusted his jacket sleeves with the calm of someone who has just finished a routine task. He looked at Victor one last time, with the coldness of someone who has already dismissed something from his field of vision and will never look at it again. "Call the feds," he said, and he walked out of the restaurant. There was no blood, no execution, no savage justice that men like Victor deserved in revenge fantasies. The justice was firm, calculated, and definitive. Victor Harlow didn't die that night, but he ceased to exist in everything that mattered. His name, his power, his freedom, his ability to cause harm, all confiscated, all dismantled, all handed over to the system that, for once, was going to work the way it should. What nobody knew until afterward was that Soren wasn't well, the shoulder wound, the one in his side, and a third problem nobody had detected, a fragment from the penthouse bullet that had lodged near the clavicle and that the initial surgery hadn't found because it was hidden behind inflamed tissue, had created a perfect storm of internal damage, infection, progressive inflammation, pressure on a subclavian artery. Soren had ignored it. He had functioned despite the pain. He had planned the operation to extract Nadia with millimetric precision. He had called Gerald Cartier with a voice that didn't waver. He had confronted Victor Harlow with the calm of a predator who knows he's the most dangerous thing in the room. He had maintained control with the same iron will that had sustained him through 41 years of life in a world that doesn't forgive weakness. But the body has limits that willpower cannot override forever, and those limits, when reached, don't negotiate. He collapsed in the back seat of the car on the way back from the restaurant. 1 second he was looking out the window. The next, his eyes closed and his body tilted like a building having its foundations removed. Isaac ran 3 red lights on the way to the clinic. Emergency surgery. 3 hours and 12 minutes, a bullet fragment the size of a pea extracted from 1 millimeter away from a major artery. Blood transfusion. Intravenous antibiotics. A team of 4 who worked in silence with the concentration of people who know they are operating on the most dangerous man in Chicago, and that the outcome of their work has implications far beyond medicine. Alawan arrived running, literally running. Nadia was behind her, trying to keep up, backpack still on her shoulder because she hadn't had time to put it down anywhere. When Dr. Merrick came out of the operating room, still wearing his surgical cap and with freshly washed hands, he wore that expression doctors use when the news is neither good nor bad, but a gray space where everything depends on time and factors medicine cannot control. We removed the fragment, we repaired the vascular damage, we controlled the infection, but he lost a lot of blood, and his body has been under extreme stress for weeks without adequate rest. The next 24 hours are critical. Alawan nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She sat down beside his bed. She took his hand, that large, calloused hand that could break bones and that had held her with the delicacy of someone touching a butterfly. And she stayed. Nadia sat on the floor by the door with her back against the wall. At 15, she understood that what was happening was bigger than her, and that the best thing she could do was be there without getting in the way. She brought coffee from the hallway machine. Nobody drank it. She left it on the bedside table like a silent offering. Isaac posted himself at the door with the expression of a man making a deal with God in which he offers everything he has, every year he has left, every favor he's owed, every prayer he never said, in exchange for that heart monitor continuing to beep. Soren's men took turns in the hallway. Silent, motionless, because in the world they lived in, where faith is a luxury and religion a memory, vigil was the only prayer they knew. At 3 a.m, when the hospital was so silent you could hear the hum of fluorescent lights, Alawan spoke, not for Nadia, who was sleeping on the floor with her head on the backpack. Not for Isaac, who was on the other side of the door. Not for the world. For him. "I didn't come here for protection," she said quietly, her fingers intertwined with his, feeling his weak but steady pulse against her skin. "At first I did. At first you were a roof and 4 walls between me and the man who wanted to kill me. Oh, you were safety. You were distance. You were the kind of shelter a person accepts because the alternative is the alley and the snow and death." She paused, breathed, organized the words she'd been building in silence for weeks, brick by brick, in that part of the heart where we keep the things we're afraid to say. But it stopped being that weeks ago. It stopped being that the day you left the botany book on the table. It stopped being that the night you sat on the other end of the couch and said nothing for an hour. It stopped being that the morning you told me I wasn't people and something inside me broke, but not the way bad things break, the way ice breaks in spring, the way a dam breaks when the water needs to flow. Her voice cracked, just once, a brief fissure across the surface. She pieced it back together like someone gathering the fragments of something they know will never be perfect again, but that's worth keeping. "And I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Not of you. Never of you. Of what it meant to love you, because loving someone when you come from where I come from, when your body is a map of everything love can do to you, when it's in the wrong hands. Loving someone is like putting your hands in the fire and hoping that this time it won't burn." The tears fell. Silent. She didn't hold them back. She had no energy left to hold them back. And besides, what for? For whom? To maintain composure in front of an unconscious man who maybe couldn't hear her, and maybe could. But you don't burn, Soren. You are the opposite of fire. You are the place where fire stops. You are the space between the storm and the roof. You are 3 a.m. on a couch where nobody talks, and where that is enough. You are the 7 o'clock coffee. You are the coat in the snow. You are the hands that held me without squeezing. You are, that's why I'm here. And you don't even know what those 4 words meant to someone who had spent years hearing nothing that wasn't an order or a threat. She rested her forehead on their intertwined hands. Othe closed her eyes. "And if I lose you now, if I lose you now, I won't recover, not this time. Not from this. I recovered from Victor. I recovered from the knife. I recovered from my father. But from losing you there is no recovery, because you are not something a person survives. You are something a person lives for." The silence in the room was absolute. Only the beep of the heart monitor. Steady, methodical, each beep a promise that Soren's heart was still beating. Only his breathing, slow, deep, mechanical. Only the weight of a truth spoken to someone who might have been able to hear it through the layers of unconsciousness. Elowen didn't move. She stayed like that, her forehead on their hands, listening to each beep as if it were a word. And she prayed, not to a specific god, not with formal words. She prayed to whatever governed a universe where two broken people could find each other in a snowy Chicago alley and decide, against all evidence, against all probability, against all logic, that the darkness was not going to win. Soren woke at 6:14 in the morning. The first thing he saw was Elowen's dark hair spread across the white clinic sheets. The first thing he felt was the weight of her hand in his. Firm, warm, present. The first thing he thought, before the pain, before spatial orientation, before remembering where he was and why, and what had happened and how much blood he'd lost, was that he was not alone. And for a man who had spent 6 years living with loneliness, the way one lives with a chronic disease, that thought was like dawn. "Elowen," he said. His voice came out hoarse, weak, human, without its usual gravity, without the control. Just a voice saying a name because that name was the first thing he wanted to exist in the air. She lifted her head sharply, red eyes, cheeks marked by the wrinkles of the sheets, hair in disarray, face swollen from crying and exhaustion, and yet the most luminous expression Soren had ever seen in his life. The expression of someone who has just received the best news in the world. "You're still here," he said. Two words that could have been a banal observation, an obvious statement, a weightless remark. But from Soren Aldrich, in that bed, in that moment, those two words held everything. The disbelief of a man who had learned through loss and betrayal and time that people leave. They always leave. That the people who matter have the insufferable habit of not being there when you need them. And the gratitude, enormous, silent, nearly unbearable, of someone who wakes up and discovers that, for the first time, someone chose to stay. "Where else would I be?" she replied with a smile that trembled at the corners but held, a smile that was half relief, half defiance, as if to say, "Did you really think I would leave? After all of this?" Soren squeezed her hand, not with force, with intention, with the exact pressure that says, "I have you," without needing to speak the words. "I heard what you said," he murmured. Elowen's eyes widened with surprise, genuine, absolute. "Everything, every word," he added. "I don't know at what point I started hearing, but your voice was there, in the dark, like a light, and nobody has ever said anything like that to me, not even the people who supposedly loved me. So I need you to know something." "What?" "That I'm not good with words. That I'll probably never be the kind of man who says beautiful things at the right moment. That I'll make mistakes. That I'll be difficult. That there are parts of me that are broken in ways I don't know can be fixed. But that if my body was capable of surviving this night, if that fragment missed the artery by 1 millimeter, if I'm still here saying these words, in this voice I don't recognize as mine, it was because you were on the other side. And that is more than I ever thought I'd have, and more than I probably deserve," Elowen cried. But this time they weren't tears of pain, or fear, or exhaustion. They were tears of something that had no name in any language in the world. Something between relief and joy, between fear and hope, between disbelief and certainty. Tears that fell not because something was breaking, but because something was being built, something fragile, imperfect, new, something neither of them had ever had, and that both of them deserved more than they knew. And he, with an effort his body protested in every muscle fiber, every suture, every nerve ending screaming at him not to move, raised his free hand and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The softest gesture Soren Aldrich had ever made in his life, a gesture that, in another context, in another life, would have been insignificant. But in that clinic room, at 6 in the morning, between a man who should have been dead and a woman who should have stopped believing, it was everything. From the floor, by the door, Nadia watched them with open eyes. She said nothing, she didn't interrupt, but she smiled, a small, private smile. The kind teenagers save for moments when the world proves to them that not everything is terrible. And then she closed her eyes and kept pretending to sleep, because she was 15. And she knew there are things that are better left alone. Chicago in spring has something winter can never promise. Proof that things grow back. The cherry trees in Lincoln Park bloomed the third week of April, as they did every year, with that brazen punctuality nature has for reminding us that the world keeps turning even when we've stopped. Lake Michigan lost winter's gray and turned blue, a deep and clean blue that stretched to the horizon like a promise. The Gold Coast penthouse was still the same floor-to-ceiling windows, the same view of the city, the same cognac, leather couch that someone had reupholstered because the blood stain wouldn't come out with any product, and because neither Soren nor Eloan wanted to keep looking at it. But it was no longer silent. Nadia was 16 now. She turned 16 in March, and Soren, who had never organized a birthday party in his life, hired a pastry chef to make a 3-tier cake that was objectively excessive for 3 people and a security team that couldn't eat while on duty. She had turned the guest room into a laboratory of adolescent chaos, posters on the walls, books on the floor, clothes that mysteriously migrated from the closet to the back of every available chair, and music that leaked from under the door at volumes Soren found objectively excessive and that he never, at any point, asked her to turn down. She was enrolled in a private school on the North Shore. She was doing well, better than well. She had a biology teacher who adored her, and a group of friends who came over on Fridays to study, and who looked at Soren with a mix of terror and fascination that he pretended not to notice and secretly found amusing. Eloan had finished the paramedic course she'd started 6 months earlier. The scar beneath her ribs had become a thin, pale line that no longer hurt when she breathed. She could run. She could stretch. She could move through the world with the physical freedom Victor had stolen from her for 8 years. Some days she still woke up startled. Some days she still needed to leave the light on. Some days a specific smell, the leather of a belt, a men's cologne too strong, would transport her to a place it took minutes to return from. But those days were fewer, and every time she opened her eyes in the dark, she found Soren awake beside her, without questions, without pressure, just there, present, constant, like a wall between her and everything trying to reach her. Soren had restructured part of his operation, not all of it. This was not a fairy tale, and he had never pretended to be a saint, nor promised to be one. The Aldrich Empire still existed. It was still powerful. It still operated in gray territories where the law didn't reach, and where the rules were written by men like him. But the lines he had drawn hardened until they became immovable. Human trafficking, eliminated. Any business involving minors, exterminated with an efficiency that made it clear there would be no second chances. Operations that harmed civilians, shut down. What remained was still dark, still an empire built in foundations society didn't approve of, but it had a code that was no longer just his. It was theirs. Eloan's, Nadia's, Yara's, whose name now meant something more than a grave. Together they created the Yara Foundation, a comprehensive assistance program for women and girls escaping situations of violence, trafficking, and abuse. Safe shelters in 3 cities, free legal assistance, psychological support with trauma specialists, job reintegration programs, educational scholarships, all funded with money that came from places nobody asked about and that reached hands that desperately needed it. Eloan ran it. With the same determination with which she had survived Victor, with the same intelligence with which she had copied the files, with the same courage with which she had run barefoot in the snow. Every woman who walked through the Foundation's doors was in some way Yara, and in some way Eloan, and in some way every woman who had ever said, "It hurts too much," and found no one on the other side. Soren protected it, not as a protector, as a partner, as the part of the team that ensured the doors were locked, that the files were confidential, that nobody, no ex, no trafficker, no cowardly father, could reach the women who sheltered there. Victor Harlow was sentenced to 34 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole for the first 20. Eloan's files, every message, every transaction, Every photograph she had copied that night while Victor slept were the centerpiece of the case. The prosecutor called it the most devastating evidence I've seen in 15 years of practice. Conrad Harlow died of a heart attack 2 months after the arrest, in an extradition hotel in Geneva, alone and forgotten. Gerald Cartier disappeared. Rumors placed him somewhere in South America, living off the money he managed to withdraw before the accounts were frozen. Elowen didn't look for him. Nadia didn't ask about him. Some absences are more eloquent than any goodbye. Dmitri, the traitor, was handed over to authorities with enough evidence to guarantee his own conviction. Soren didn't touch him. Not out of mercy. Soren Aldrich was not a merciful man. But because Elowen had taught him, without speeches, without sermons, without moral lessons, simply with her presence and her example, that there are forms of justice that don't require blood, that sometimes the worst, revenge is letting the system do its work, that sometimes the most powerful way to win is not becoming what you destroyed. One evening in May, one of those spring nights, where Chicago becomes kind, where the air is warm and the windows can be open and the sounds of the city arrive like an imperfect lullaby, Elowen was sitting on the living room couch, holding a cup of chamomile tea that had long gone cold, reading a foundation report. Nadia was asleep. Her music no longer leaked from under the door. The city glowed. Soren walked in, took off his jacket, loosened his tie, and sat beside her, not at the other end of the couch, like at the beginning, next to her. No space, no distance, with the ease of someone for whom closeness is no longer a risk, but a choice, and one he makes every day without hesitation. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned against his chest. She listened to his heart, that heartbeat that nearly stopped on an operating table and that now sounded so firm, so present, so undeniably alive. A heartbeat she had learned to recognize as the sound of safety, not the safety of an armored building or a team of bodyguards. The safety of knowing that someone is there, that someone stays, that someone chooses you every day, not because they have to, but because they want to. Soren? Do you remember what you said to me the first night, in the alley? Every word. I want you to know something, she said, and her voice was soft but firm, like water running over stone. It doesn't hurt anymore. He pulled her closer, rested his chin on her head, closed his eyes, and said, in the softest voice Elowen had ever heard him use, softer than that night in the alley, softer than that morning in the clinic, the voice of a man who finally, after 6 years, allows himself to be tender. You will never face pain alone again, never. She lifted her head, she looked at him, she looked at him with those brown eyes that had seen hell and that still, despite everything, against everything, beyond everything, were capable of shining, and with that smile that was hers and only hers, the one that had survived the beatings, the knives, the sleepless nights, the guilt, the fear, the alley, the snow, and that was still, after everything, capable of lighting up an entire room, she replied, neither will you. Outside, Chicago kept spinning, noisy, relentless, indifferent. The traffic on Lakeshore Drive sounded like a distant river. The lights on Navy Pier flickered like stars that refused to go out. And somewhere in the city, in an alley on the south side, last winter's snow had melted months ago, taking with it the bloodstains and the traces of a night that changed 2 lives forever. But inside those walls, on that couch, under the dim light of a lamp Elowen had chosen, because it reminded her of something warm, something she couldn't name but recognized as the feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. 2 people the world had broken in different ways, at different times, for different reasons, had found a way to hold each other up. It wasn't a perfect ending. It was better than that. It was a real ending, with scars that still itched on rainy days, with work that never ended, with good days where everything shone and hard days where the shadows returned uninvited, with a teenager who played her music too loud and who now called Soren by his first name, not Mr. Aldrich, not that man, just Soren, said with the casual familiarity of someone who has decided you are family, with a man who still dreamed of warehouses and a flight that arrived late and a 22-year-old woman who designed libraries, and with a woman who still left the light on at night, but who needed less and less brightness to feel safe, because safety was no longer in a lamp, it was in a heartbeat. They were together, and together, with all their imperfections, with all their ghosts, with all their sharp edges and their long silences and their scars that told stories no one else would understand, was enough. Together was everything.